Welcome back, deep divers. Sometimes you think you've explored every last corner of a topic, especially when it comes to historical mysteries. We've certainly dug into the dramatic conclusion of World War II in our previous 6-episode series, sifting through countless sources, unearthing so many fascinating facts. But what if I told you that even after all that, there are still deeper layers to uncover, secrets tucked away in the archives, and information that, to our knowledge, has remained largely unexamined and unpublished before? That's right, this isn't just another deep dive, this is a very special bonus deep dive. We've continued sifting through even more material, and what we found is truly remarkable, some of the most compelling and frankly astonishing information we've ever encountered on this topic, much of it previously undiscussed. We're about to push the very edges of what we thought we knew about post-WWII events, particularly concerning one of the most enigmatic and least understood places on Earth, Antarctica.
Absolutely. What we're about to unpack today fundamentally challenges some deeply ingrained assumptions about history's final chapters and, the nature of global conflict. Our mission today is to meticulously examine sources hinting at a persistent, covert conflict that continued long after the official surrender in Europe. And crucially, we'll shine a bright light on a mysterious U.S. operation in the South Atlantic called Operation ARGUS. We'll first lay out the officially accepted narrative, and then, with the help of this newly accessible information, we'll raise some truly fascinating and, at times, unsettling questions about its true underlying purpose.
So, if you're ready to dive into some truly surprising facts, connect some dots you might never have considered before, and perhaps even reshape your understanding of 20th century history, grab your metaphorical headlamps, because we are going deeper than ever before. Okay, let's really unpack this initial premise because it's foundational to everything we'll discuss. When we typically talk about May 1945 and the official end of World War II in Europe, the common perception is that Nazi Germany utterly collapsed, the fighting stopped everywhere, and that was that. A clear, decisive victory. But our sources suggest this understanding might be far too simplistic, perhaps even deliberately misleading. The narrative we've generally accepted of a complete and total cessation of hostilities across the board might not tell even half the story. It implies a clean break. But what if the picture was far messier, far more complex, and, well, far more protracted?
What's truly fascinating here is the assertion, based on these news sources, that the powerful Axis machinery, particularly Nazi Germany, remained incredibly strong strategically and perhaps even militarily, even at the very point of official capitulation in Europe. The claim isn't that Germany was completely defeated in every corner or that its entire infrastructure was dismantled. No. Instead, the sources argue that only the Wehrmacht, the conventional armed forces, formally surrendered. And even then, it wasn't universal. Crucially, the elite units, the more ideologically committed forces and significant, powerful factions within the Nazi state itself, apparently did not surrender. This distinction is absolutely vital, suggesting a far more fragmented and nuanced end to the European conflict than a simple blanket defeat. It reframes the capitulation not as a total collapse, but perhaps as a strategic realignment by certain elements.
This raises an incredibly important question for anyone trying to understand this period. Who really surrendered, and on whose terms? The sources point to the significant and perhaps previously underappreciated growth of non-party factions within Nazi Germany, suggesting they had a substantial, almost decisive influence on the capitulation itself. We hear about figures like Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who was appointed president by Hitler in his final will, or perhaps after his escape, depending on which part of the narrative you follow. Dönitz reportedly sent signals to the Allies, attempting to portray a Germany now supposedly free of Nazis who had either died or fled. This was apparently an attempt to preserve what remained of the German state apparatus, to negotiate a future that wouldn't involve total annihilation. It sounds less like an unconditional surrender and more like a shrewd, strategic maneuver designed to protect assets, personnel, and perhaps even long-term objectives. He wasn't just capitulating, he was actively attempting to reshape the narrative and perhaps the very structure of what remained of the German state, almost setting the stage for a different kind of post-war reality.
Right, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, it suggests a far more fragmented and complex power structure within the Third Reich than we often assume, with different factions holding sway and making their own strategic decisions, sometimes in opposition to the conventional military. And crucially, what these sources indicate is that fighting, far from ceasing across the board, continued in numerous, often intense pockets around the world, even after the European surrender. This wasn't a sudden, quiet end. It was a complex transition. Perhaps even a continuation of conflict in different forms and locations, evolving from open warfare to more clandestine operations. The official VE Day might have been a milestone, but it wasn't by any stretch a true end to all hostilities for all parties involved.
And here's where it gets really interesting, and frankly challenges everything we've been taught. Our sources list specific locations where bitter fighting continued long after the official capitulation in May 1945, some for weeks or even months. We're talking about places you'd expect, like Mayenburg and areas around Hamburg, but then it expands dramatically. Southern Bavaria, where remnants of the SS and other elite units reportedly made desperate stands. The besieged fortress of Roka, which held out heroically or perhaps stubbornly for weeks beyond Berlin's fall. Isolated French Atlantic ports like La Rochelle and Saint-Nazaire, which were still occupied by German garrisons. But it doesn't stop there. The fighting also apparently continued in Czechoslovakia, particularly around Prague, where the resistance faced fierce German retaliation. On the Hel Peninsula in Poland, northern Croatia, southern Italy, where some German units refused to surrender, Austria, West Holland, Denmark, and even southern Norway. This isn't just isolated skirmishes or mop-up operations. This implies a sustained multi-front effort by elements of the German military and other factions that explicitly refuse to lay down arms. It suggests a level of organized resistance far beyond mere pockets of desperate soldiers. The sheer geographical spread of these ongoing conflicts paints a very different, far more unsettling picture of post-May 1945 Europe. It's almost as if certain parts of the war simply moved underground or to the periphery rather than truly ending.
This leads to a truly provocative thought. If Germany, or at least powerful remnants and factions within its sphere, was engaged in conflicts across such a vast global footprint, from isolated European pockets to far-flung outposts, can we truly say they lost the war solely in Europe in a comprehensive, all-encompassing sense? The sources frame the capitulation more as a political game, a strategic maneuver designed, in part, to facilitate the American entry into Europe and a swift shift of focus away from the perceived immediate German threat and towards the Soviet Union. Figures like General Patton, even before the official surrender, already saw the Soviets as the next adversary, the real long-term threat to Western interests. This suggests that the end of the European theater was not simply a military defeat, but a complex geopolitical realignment, with ongoing conflicts serving as a bloody backdrop to a new strategic calculus. A Cold War that arguably began even before the official end of the hot one. The loss in Europe might have been a strategic withdrawal or a partial capitulation by some factions, rather than total annihilation or surrender by all elements of the Nazi state. This rereading of history compels us to consider who was truly in control and what their ultimate long-term goals might have been beyond the battlefield.
So if the war wasn't entirely over in the conventional sense, if these lingering conflicts were indeed taking place, what else was brewing in the shadows? The sources drop some incredibly intriguing hints about Allied intelligence during the early stages of the war, even before the US formally entered. They claim that both the British and Americans were well aware of certain deeply secretive German plans and facilities. Specifically, they mention Base 21 and other cool plans, even referring to something called Sigma Vini early in the war. Now, these aren't widely known terms in mainstream historical accounts, which makes their appearance here all the more significant. This implies a level of foresight and intelligence gathering that goes far beyond what we typically understand about the Allied strategic picture. It suggests a pre-existing awareness of a German long-term strategy that extended far beyond the battlefields of Europe.
This indeed suggests a much deeper, earlier understanding of German clandestine activities than commonly acknowledged. What's particularly striking, and frankly, almost unbelievable, is the assertion that a process of settling military personnel and civilian scientists in New Swabia, a vast region of Antarctica claimed by Germany, was underway from the very beginning of the war, perhaps even before. This wasn't a desperate post-war escape or a last-ditch effort after the collapse. No. The sources posit this was a pre-existing, long-term strategic initiative, a carefully planned continuation or relocation of certain critical elements of the German state. It suggests a long-term vision that extended far beyond the European front, a contingency plan for a hidden parallel existence. And the sources make a peculiar claim about how Germany properly acquired New Swabia before the war, stating they did so by finding a piece of ice. While this sounds almost whimsical and certainly unconventional, it underscores the unusual, almost absurd nature of these alleged territorial claims and operations in Antarctica. Perhaps it refers to a symbolic or covert method of establishing presence, rather than formal annexation. But it highlights the surreal nature of this particular historical narrative and the lengths to which these factions supposedly went to secure a distant foothold.
Right. Fast forward to just after the war, and we arrive at Operation Highjump, the massive U.S. expedition to Antarctica led by the legendary Admiral Richard E. Byrd between 1946 and 1947. Officially, it was presented as a mapping and exploration mission, a seemingly benign scientific endeavor to map the continent and test equipment in extreme cold. But our sources paint a very different, far more dramatic, and indeed violent picture of what transpired during that expedition. This wasn't just about charting ice sheets, it was apparently a confrontation.
The sources declare Highjump a resounding failure from a military perspective, stating unequivocally that the Americans got a beating from the Germans. And here's a truly astonishing, almost mind-bending detail that challenges our entire understanding of mid-20th century technology. They attribute this decisive defeat to the Germans possessing anti-gravity vehicles. This isn't just an advanced aircraft. This implies technology that defies our conventional understanding of physics for that era, suggesting a monumental, almost alien secret. If true, it would have reshaped the entire trajectory of post-war power, rendering conventional military forces virtually obsolete in certain contexts. The implications for military strategy, even today, are staggering. This fundamentally alters the perception of the technological landscape at the time, introducing a completely unforeseen and almost unbelievable element into the post-war conflict and suggesting a significant, almost insurmountable technological disparity that the U.S. encountered. This wasn't just a conventional military encounter. It was, according to these sources, something entirely terrifyingly different.
This leads us directly to Admiral Byrd himself and a statement he reportedly made that sends shivers down your spine when you consider this new context. The source highlights a March 1947 interview he gave to Lee Van Atta, a prominent English war correspondent. Imagine the scene. A high-ranking admiral, celebrated for his exploration and stoicism, standing before the press after such an expedition. In this interview, Byrd reportedly issued a stark and unbelievably direct warning that the United States should adopt protection measures against the possibility of an invasion of the country by hostile aircraft coming from the polar regions. He didn't mince words. He used incredibly strong, unambiguous words like invasion and emphasized the incredible speed of these aircraft. It wasn't a subtle hint. It was a public, dire warning from a decorated military official, which is remarkable in itself and a stark contrast to the official narrative of Highjump being a mere scientific success. He wasn't just speculating, he was warning about a very real, very fast, very hostile threat.
This raises an incredibly important question, one that demands an answer. Why would an admiral of Byrd's stature, speaking at that time, issue such a dire and almost apocalyptic warning if his expedition was merely a scientific survey? The text suggests he was caught in an agonizing dilemma, torn between maintaining the intense secrecy about what he had truly witnessed in Antarctica and an urgent, profound moral need to warn the American people about an adversary they might not be able to defeat with conventional means. The implication is crystal clear. Something profound, unsettling, and militarily superior happened during Highjump. Its impact was significant enough to penetrate the steel brains of the American Admiralty and reshape their strategic thinking. This encounter, whatever its true nature, profoundly set the stage for what came next in U.S. military planning and operations, hinting at a new kind of war against a new kind of enemy far from public view.
So if Operation Highjump was, according to these sources, a beating for the U.S., and Admiral Byrd was issuing dire warnings about an unforeseen, technologically superior threat emanating from the polar regions, how exactly did the United States military respond to such an alarming and unprecedented situation? Our sources indicate that in the wake of Highjump's apparent failure and the subsequent intelligence, the immediate and urgent need for a distant, quick, decisive way to neutralize such an advanced threat became an absolute priority. Conventional military methods, it seems, were simply not sufficient to counter what Byrd had allegedly encountered. This set the stage for something drastic.
This is precisely where Operation Argus comes into play. Officially, it was conceived as a series of U.S. atmospheric nuclear weapon tests conducted in August and September 1958 by the Defense Nuclear Agency. Its stated purpose was highly specific and seemingly scientific, to explore the effects of nuclear explosions outside the Earth's atmosphere, specifically at very high altitudes ranging from 194 to 480 kilometers, effectively in the vacuum of space. The official narrative presents it as a purely scientific endeavor aimed at understanding the interaction of nuclear blasts with Earth's upper atmosphere, a test of theoretical physics applied to defense.
Right. They were supposedly looking to understand exactly how those high-altitude explosions would impact space-based systems. Picture this. A nuclear blast high up releases incredibly energetic, electrically charged particles and radioactive isotopes. The official line was that these particles would interact with Earth's magnetic field. Imagine Earth is surrounded by an invisible magnetic shield. These charged particles don't just go straight, they get trapped and guided by that magnetic shield, creating a kind of artificial radiation belt that could scramble communications, disrupt radar tracking, and potentially fry the electronics of satellites and ballistic missiles. This was critical defense research in the early days of the space race and ICBM development. There's even a curious mention in some circles that proponents of the unidentified flying object phenomenon see this operation as an attempt by Americans to literally pierce the firmament or sky, adding yet another layer of almost mythological intrigue to its purported scientific purpose.
What's truly remarkable about Operation Argus, even by its official accounts, is its sheer unprecedented scale. The New York Times reportedly called it the largest scientific experiment ever conducted at the time. This wasn't some small, discrete mission. It was a massive undertaking that drew significant attention and resources within government circles, despite the underlying secrecy that, as we'll discuss, continues to surround it. The sheer expenditure of resources alone suggests a purpose far grander or more urgent than a mere academic inquiry into atmospheric physics.
And think about this for a moment. The manpower and naval power assembled for this scientific experiment were staggering. We're talking about 4,500 military personnel, along with civilian support, and a dedicated fleet of 9 warships. The sources list some of them, giving us a concrete, almost overwhelming picture of the naval power assembled for this operation. The destroyers USS Beaufort, USS Owens, USS Courtney, USS Parker, the tanker USS Alana, and the rocket ships USS Canberra, USS Toledo, and USS Norton Sound. And if that weren't enough, the sources also mention an aircraft carrier being involved, a detail that, if true, would dramatically add to the incredible resources deployed. An aircraft carrier signals an operation of immense strategic importance, one typically associated with major military engagements, not just a few high-altitude launches for scientific data. This level of commitment for a stated purpose seems incredibly disproportionate.
It really does. This leads us to a crucial detail that truly makes Operation Argus stand out among all other nuclear tests. Between 1945 and 1962, the U.S. conducted a staggering 235 nuclear tests, both underground and in the upper atmosphere, and even in space. But our sources emphasize that Operation Argus was the only atmospheric nuclear weapon test conducted in the South Atlantic during that entire period. Its unique, isolated location, far from any established test sites, and, as we'll soon see, the tight veil of secrecy surrounding it make it stand out dramatically from all other tests. This begs a profound question. Was the secrecy related solely to the groundbreaking results of the radioactive fallout research, or was there something far more profound and undisclosed at play, something that necessitated such extreme measures in such a specific, unusual location?
Now, here's where we move beyond the official report and really start asking some uncomfortable, even challenging questions. We've just heard about the enormous resources deployed for Operation Argus, 4,500 people, 9 ships, potentially an aircraft carrier. This was an undertaking of epic proportions, a truly vast commitment of manpower and naval assets. It suggests an objective of paramount importance, far beyond what was publicly stated.
This raises an immediate and critical question, one that demands a logical answer. Why would such a massive undertaking, such an enormous deployment of resources, manpower, and naval might, be necessary to launch just 3 nuclear-tipped missiles and 4 telemetry rockets into the upper atmosphere? The sheer disproportion between the means employed and the stated purely scientific ends is striking. It simply doesn't add up. Why deploy an entire naval task force and thousands of personnel for a handful of launches that could ostensibly be handled by a much smaller, more specialized team, perhaps from a land-based site or even a single ship? This immediately makes you wonder if there was another unstated purpose.
And who, you might ask, was truly behind this seemingly odd and disproportionately massive decision? Our sources point to a curious and, frankly, rather obscure figure, Nikolai Christopoulos. He was a Greek-American former wind mechanic during WWII who, remarkably, studied physics in his free time. The report claims President Dwight D. Eisenhower himself approved this vast and unprecedented operation, apparently almost exclusively to test a theory put forth by Christopoulos. I mean, a former mechanic advising the President of the United States on a multi-million-dollar nuclear operation. That's quite a leap. It seems odd, to say the least, for someone with such an unconventional unconventional background to have such direct and singular influence on a presidential decision of this magnitude, leading to the creation of a specialized Task Force 88 just to launch 3 missiles into the upper atmosphere. It suggests either an extraordinary, unrecognized genius on Christopoulos' part, or, more plausibly, an underlying, undisclosed reason for the operation that allowed his theory to be the convenient official justification.
The location of Operation Argus is another significant point of contention and a major crack in the official narrative. Officially, it took place over a generic area of the South Atlantic. However, our sources specify that it was between 1,400 and 2,000 miles north of Queen Maud Land. This precise geographic detail is highly significant because Queen Maud Land is identified in these sources as German territory, specifically New Swabia. This is the very same region which the Third Reich had reportedly acquired properly before the war, as we mentioned earlier, by finding a piece of ice. A peculiar claim that nonetheless highlights their purported pre-war presence and claims. This geographic detail immediately shifts the context of the operation from a generic atmospheric test to one with a very specific, historically sensitive, and potentially hostile target area. It's no longer just the South Atlantic, it's perilously close to an alleged secret German stronghold.
And here's where it gets really interesting and frankly disturbing, directly challenging the official high-altitude detonation claim. The sources state that sailors on the ships involved in Operation Argus, some reportedly as close as 6 miles from the test, fell ill with leukemia, a devastating disease caused by nuclear fallout. This is utterly inexplicable and, frankly, scientifically impossible if the nuclear detonations truly occurred at altitudes of 194 to 480 kilometers effectively in space. To be clear, radioactive fallout from explosions at hundreds of kilometers altitude would disperse so widely in the upper atmosphere and beyond that it simply wouldn't cause acute radiation sickness, let alone widespread leukemia at sea level. Think of it like this. If you light a match in a small room, you'll feel the heat. If you light that same match in a football stadium, you won't. The physical effects of a blast, especially direct fallout, on personnel at sea level from such extreme heights would be virtually non-existent, certainly not severe enough to cause widespread long-term radiation sickness like leukemia. This discrepancy creates a massive, undeniable crack in the official narrative. It suggests the sailors were far, far too close for the official story to hold water.
Precisely. This identical radioactive fallout, causing severe illness as if from a close range, perhaps even surface-level detonation, is completely inconsistent with the official narrative of very high-altitude explosions. The science simply doesn't support it. This anomaly strongly suggests that Task Force 88 was positioned much closer to the actual detonation site than officially admitted. If the sailors experienced symptoms of acute and long-term radiation exposure, then the explosions must have occurred at a much, much lower altitude, or perhaps even on the surface or just below it, in proximity to their vessels. This raises profound, urgent questions about the true nature, location, and devastating consequences of these nuclear events. It fundamentally shifts the context from a benign scientific experiment to a highly dangerous, possibly combat-related operation.
So what does this all mean when you pull these threads together? The glaring anomalies, the massive, disproportionate resources deployed for the stated purpose, the peculiar and seemingly outsized influence of a former mechanic on a presidential decision of this magnitude, the undeniable proximity of radiation sickness experienced by the personnel, and the unusual location of the test relative to known alleged German Antarctic claims all point towards a hypothesis that goes far beyond simple atmospheric testing. The pieces of the puzzle just don't fit the official picture, leaving a void that these alternative sources attempt to fill.
Indeed, it becomes quite obvious, as the source states, that there is a strong possibility the true, undisclosed objective of Operation Argus was not merely scientific research. Instead, it was to bombard a specific region where a Third Reich object or facility supposedly existed. This would have been on what the sources identify as German territory in New Swabia. The staggering implication here is that despite the official capitulation in Europe and unknown to the wider world, these German factions were still capable of waging war from a second Third Reich state, complete with its alleged capital of New Berlin, deep within the Antarctic continent. This paints a picture of a continued unacknowledged conflict, making the South Atlantic a new secret front in a war the public believed had ended.
And if previous conventional military approaches, like Admiral Byrd's Operation Highjump, had demonstrably failed to neutralize this alleged technologically superior threat, then resorting to launching nuclear missiles would have been considered the ultimate measure, a decisive, desperate, and extreme act designed to eliminate a persistent and seemingly unassailable adversary. It speaks to a level of profound desperation and the perceived severity of the threat that such extreme, world-altering measures would have been greenlit by the highest levels of government. It implies that nothing else worked, or perhaps nothing else could work against this hidden enemy.
We can only speculate on the precise details and the full scope of what transpired, but it raises the chilling possibility that the personnel of Task Force 88 were not merely conducting scientific tests from a safe distance. Instead, they might have been deliberately positioned to witness and verify the destruction of these alleged German Nazi military camps or other strategic facilities. The devastating leukemia cases among the sailors, which we discussed, once again speak volumes about their proximity to significant, very low altitude or even surface-level nuclear events. This transforms the entire narrative of Operation Argus from a benign scientific experiment into a covert military strike, with the human cost of the operation being a direct and tragic consequence of its true, undisclosed purpose. It forces us to reconsider the very nature of what was considered peace in the immediate post-war era.
This deep dive, particularly this bonus episode filled with previously unexamined information, would be truly incomplete without examining another absolutely crucial piece of the puzzle. That, when viewed with this new lens, seemingly ties all these disparate threads together: the Antarctic Treaty. This landmark international agreement was signed in Washington, D.C. on December 1st, 1959, just a little over a year after Operation Argus concluded in the South Atlantic. The timing, in light of everything we've just discussed, is not just suspicious, it's incredibly suggestive.
What's truly fascinating here is that precise timing. Our sources suggest the treaty was signed as if the matter at the South Pole had been settled. It's a highly specific, comprehensive document covering a vast and remote continent, and Article 1 of this treaty explicitly states that Antarctica shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. This isn't just a general guideline. This is a foundational principle, clearly laying out a very firm intent for the future of the continent. It's a statement designed to prevent past events from occurring or new conflicts from emerging.
And listen to what it specifically, unequivocally forbids in Article 1. Military measures, military bases, fortifications, military maneuvers, and critically, the testing of any type of weapon. And it explicitly clarifies that weapon includes nuclear weapons. That's a powerful, clear, and comprehensive prohibition. It doesn't just broadly discourage military activity, it targets specific actions, particularly those involving weapons. And nuclear weapons are singled out with unmistakable clarity. It's almost as if they were saying, no more of that.
This immediately raises a profound question, a fundamental inconsistency in the official historical narrative. Why would a comprehensive international treaty signed by major world powers specifically ban something that, according to official narratives, never happened in that region? If no nuclear tests had ever occurred on or near Antarctica, why dedicate such a significant and explicit clause to prohibiting them? Why not just a general ban on military activity? The specificity suggests a response to a very real, very specific past event.
It's almost comical, isn't it? As the source playfully suggests, would a law be passed to ban whale hunting in an area where no one had ever hunted whales? You wouldn't prohibit something that simply doesn't exist or hasn't occurred, would you? Or would metal detectors be installed in schools if there had never been an incident to justify them? The answer, of course, is no. Laws, regulations, and treaties are typically enacted in direct response to existing problems, confirmed activities, or very clear and present dangers. The very existence of this clause, then, acts as almost a smoking gun, a silent but powerful admission of past nuclear activity in the region, despite official denials.
The sources are quite direct here, stating with compelling simplicity, it is clear what is happening here. The primary aim of the Antarctic Treaty is to specifically prohibit something that, according to official history, never happened. And yet, if you consult British standards, they confirm that no nuclear tests were ever conducted on or near Antarctica in their records. So, again, why this precise prohibition? This glaring contradiction, this historical lacuna, strongly suggests an untold story, a truth carefully concealed behind diplomatic language.
The answer, according to our sources, is remarkably simple and direct. Because it did happen. And not just once or twice, but often enough that it became a significant, undeniable concern for everyone involved, the signatory nations. That's precisely when laws and treaties are enacted to prevent the recurrence of confirmed events to draw a line in the sand. The Antarctic Treaty, therefore, despite its seemingly peaceful rhetoric, implicitly acknowledges what the official reports deny, serving as a powerful, if indirect, confirmation of past nuclear activity in the region.
The Antarctic Treaty, in essence, declares no more nuclear tests in Antarctica. And when we consider which operations have the capability and the strategic imperative to conduct such tests in that incredibly remote region, Operation Argus by the United States is the only one that fits the time frame and unique context. Given its official status as the sole South Atlantic atmospheric test of that period, the idea that Argus was merely about launching missiles straight up into space over a generic part of the South Atlantic, 1,400 to 2,000 miles from the alleged Third Reich base, becomes far, far less convincing. When viewed through the combined lens of this treaty's explicit prohibitions and the undeniable tragic reality of radiation sickness among the involved personnel, the treaty then, rather than being a standalone diplomatic achievement, becomes a capstone to a deeply unsettling narrative of a secret conflict and desperate measures.
So, if all of this is true, if World War II's ending was far more complex, if there was a hidden conflict in Antarctica involving advanced, almost unbelievable technology, and if nuclear weapons were potentially used in a covert operation, what does all this mean for today? Our sources suggest that the need for intense secrecy surrounding these events might not just be about protecting past reputations or maintaining historical narratives. It could, remarkably, have ongoing implications for current geopolitical dynamics. Some secrets, it seems, are simply too sensitive, too profound to ever fully reveal, even decades later.
Consider the compelling and illustrative case of Rainer Danehart. He's a researcher who reportedly wrote to both the US and UK governments, directly inquiring about atomic weapon tests on or near Antarctica. The US government's official response was succinct and specific. Operation Argus, a direct acknowledgement of that particular operation. However, the British government's response was quite different. They referred him to the British Antarctic Survey, which then categorically denied any nuclear tests in or near the region whatsoever. This is a stark contradiction, not just between a curious researcher and official channels, but between two allied nations, revealing a fundamental disagreement, or perhaps a differing level of disclosure regarding these historical events. Why would two close allies offer such divergent answers to the same factual query?
This discrepancy is incredibly interesting, and it goes far beyond a simple administrative error. It's not just about the conflicting answers, it's about what it reveals about a huge need for non-disclosure on this specific topic. It's as if admitting the full truth about Argus or other operations is still unwanted, still too sensitive, even more than 60 years later. The persistence of such a strong need for secrecy, despite the passage of time and the supposed declassification of historical documents, raises profound questions about what other information might still be under wraps and, crucially, why. What could possibly be so sensitive that it remains hidden from public view even now?
This powerful and continuing need for secrecy decades after the events could imply something truly remarkable. That operations in the same warfare context as 1945 are, astonishingly, still ongoing. Recalling the Kriegsmarine flotilla allegedly breaking into southern waters during Operation Highjump and the subsequent highly unusual behavior observed, the sources suggest that revealing information about past operations, even ones as old as Operation Argus, might still be strategically undesirable today. This suggests an unbroken chain of strategic concern related to these events, implying that the enemy or the strategic objectives haven't fully dissipated. It hints at a long game, played out over generations, far from public scrutiny.
And what's the ultimate, incredibly intriguing implication here for our current world? The sources propose that this could mean the former allies are still seeking the old enemy, even to this day, suggesting a continuous, if deeply hidden, effort to track or neutralize these elusive factions. However, the sources also offer a fascinating counterpoint, acknowledging that perhaps hands have been shaken. They reference Operation Paperclip, where former Nazi adversaries, particularly scientists, found themselves working alongside their former enemies in the United States. This presents a fascinating dichotomy, a prolonged secret hunt or perhaps a secret alliance formed out of necessity, with former foes now sharing knowledge and perhaps even a common objective against a different unknown entity. It leaves us with a truly unsettling question about who the real players were and are on the global stage.
This entire deep dive raises an incredibly important question for you, our dedicated learner, to carry forward. If major foundational historical events like the definitive end of World War II or a significant U.S. military operation like ARGUS can contain such profound hidden layers that completely recontextualize what we thought we knew, what does that tell us about the nature of information, secrecy, and geopolitical power in our world even now? How much of what we accept as settled history might be far more complex, far more nuanced, far more shocking than we've been led to believe?
Wow, what an absolutely incredible deep dive. We started by challenging the very notion of a clear, definitive end to World War II, explored the whispers of a hidden, technologically advanced Nazi presence in Antarctica, and then meticulously uncovered the layers of mystery surrounding Operation Argus, a mission that, when viewed through these news sources, appears to be far, far more than its official story suggests. This bonus deep dive has certainly delivered on its promise of previously unexamined information.
And connecting it all back to the Antarctic Treaty, which, when viewed with this new information, almost serves as a confirmation of events that official records steadfastly deny ever took place. It truly reinforces the profound idea that history is rarely as simple as it seems on the surface, and that the official narrative is often just one, perhaps carefully constructed, layer of a much deeper, more complex, and often more uncomfortable truth.
Exactly. This bonus deep dive, filled with information that, to our knowledge, hasn't been widely published or discussed before, highlights just how many questions remain unanswered and how much there is still to learn about events we thought we understood. It's a powerful, almost unsettling reminder that sometimes the most important knowledge is found not in what's widely publicized, but in the details that have been carefully kept in the shadows, waiting for us to shine a light on them.
So for you, our dedicated learner, the provocative thought to carry forward from this deep dive is this. If such significant historical actions could be hidden, misconstrued, or recontextualized for so long, what other settled narratives might contain similar, startling depths just waiting for a deeper look? What will you choose to explore next, and what hidden truths might you uncover?
Thank you for joining us on this truly extraordinary bonus deep dive. We hope this has given you plenty to mull over, perhaps even sparked a new kind of curiosity about the hidden corners of history. Until next time, stay curious and keep digging deeper.